In the pre-dawn darkness of the 4th of June, at a point 240 miles northwest of Midway, the first attack wave was about to take off from Admiral Nagumo's carriers for the strike on Midway. A southeasterly breeze and calm sea provided ideal launching conditions. The eastern sky was tinged with a faint glow which dimly outlined the horizon. It was 40 minutes before sunup when the loudspeakers barked out the command, "Aviators, assemble." There was a quick scurry of pilots to the briefing room under the bridge. Too weary to follow, I remained alone at the flight control station. The flyers were soon back on deck running toward their planes. The air officer returned to the control post and began shouting a quick succession of orders. "All hands to launching stations. Start engines. Captain, head full into the wind. And increase speed for a relative velocity of 14 meters. Plane engines were started, and livid white flames spurted from exhaust pipes. The flight deck was soon a hell of ear-shattering noise. Lieutenant Takehiko Chihaya, in full flying gear, stopped briefly at the flight control station and bade me goodbye. I wished him luck and watched him go nimbly down a ladder and jump into the cockpit of his lead dive bomber, waiting near the base of the bridge. The wing lights of his plane blinked on, indicating that he was ready, and soon the blue and red lights of all the planes glowed in the darkness. "All planes ready, sir," an orderly reported. Floodlights suddenly illuminated the flight deck, making day of the night. "Planes ready for takeoff, sir," the air officer reported to the ship's captain. Akagi was steaming full into the wind with speed increased, and the wind gauge showed the required velocity. "Commence launching," came the order from the bridge. Swinging a green signal lamp, the air officer described a big circle in the air. A Zero fighter, leading the flock of impatient warbirds, revved up its engine, gathered speed along the flight deck, and rose into the air to the accompaniment of a thunderous cheer from Akagi's crew. Caps and hands waved wildly in the bright glare of the deck lights. The first plane was followed by 8 more Zeros. Then came the dive bombers, each carrying a 250-kilogram land bomb. The canopy of Chihaya's plane was open, and the young leader waved goodbye to the cheering hands on deck. The next instant the plane rose into the darkness with a loud roar. Soon all 18 dive bombers were in the air. Overhead a neat array of red and blue lights showed that the Zeros were in formation. Some 4,000 meters to port, Hiryu was also launching planes. Thin streaks of light followed each other skyward from the floodlit deck. In 15 minutes the 4 carriers had launched a total of 108 planes. While forming up, they made a great circle over the fleet and then headed off into the southeastern sky at 0445. Overall commander of the first attack wave was Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, personally leading 36 Type 97 level bombers from Soryu and Hiryu. To his left followed 36 Type 99 dive bombers from Akagi and Kaga, led by Lieutenant Shoichi Agawa, a Kaga squadron commander. Lieutenant Masaharu Shuganami of Soryu led the fighter escort of 36 Zeros. 108 planes in all. This was Tomonaga's first sortie of the Pacific War. He had reported to Hiryu just before her departure from the homeland. He was, however, a veteran of the Sino-Japanese War and a capable and experienced flyer, well qualified to lead the attack. Lieutenant Agawa, a gallant pilot, had been in every action of the Nagumo force since Pearl Harbor. His skill and daring were unequaled in the Naval Air Corps. Lieutenant Shuganami, like most of the pilots, was also a veteran of the Pacific War since the Pearl Harbor attack. Full of fighting spirit, he was a typical fighter pilot. All the other pilots were well trained, and most were experienced. They worked together well as a team. I watched their lights disappear into the darkness, regretting my illness and praying for their good luck. The flight deck, which moments before had been filled with a deafening din, was now silent. There were no planes, no drone of engines. Only a few deckhands ran here and there, busily stowing various pieces of gear. But the stillness was again broken by the raucous loudspeaker as it blared out the order, "Prepare second attack wave." To the accompaniment of clanging bells, planes soon were being whisked up to the flight deck and rolled from the elevators to their line-up positions. The forward elevators brought up fighters, the midship and stern elevators delivered bombers. Maintenance crews wheeled torpedoes from the ammunition rooms and secured them to the planes. All hands worked feverishly. There was no time for rest as the first light of dawn was beginning to brighten the eastern sky. It was 05 when the crimson sun rose over the horizon. The flight deck was again filled with planes ready to attack in the event an enemy task force appeared. The dive bombers each carried one 250-kilogram bomb, and the level bombers each carried a torpedo. The second attack wave also totaled 108 planes, 36 Type 99 dive bombers, 36 Type 97 torpedo bombers, and 36 Zero fighters. The dive bomber group was led by Lieutenant Commander Takashi Jagusa, from Soryu, long the Navy's leading expert in dive bombing. When Japan began girding herself for war, his dive bomber group had trained vigorously with the aim of destroying the United States carrier fleet at one blow. They had had no opportunity for this in the Pearl Harbor attack because no aircraft carriers had been present that day. In the Indian Ocean operations that followed, however, they had demonstrated their proficiency by sending the British carrier Hermes as well as cruisers Dorsetshire and Cornwall to the bottom. Now the opportunity they had waited for seemed near at hand. No wonder excitement ran high. The leader of the torpedo bomber group was Lieutenant Commander Shigeharu Murata, from Akagi. When the Pearl Harbor operation had first been envisaged, an aerial torpedo attack was thought impossible because of the shallow harbor. It was through Murata's untiring and arduous efforts that this problem had been overcome, and he had led the torpedo planes to their brilliant successes in the Pearl Harbor strike. Now he hoped to display equal effectiveness on the open sea. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Ataya, of Akagi, who commanded the fighter escort group, was another veteran of long flying experience. One of the senior fighter pilots of the fleet, his brilliant war record had already established him as an ace. Indeed, these three leaders were the best possible men for the job at hand, and their flyers were the elite of the naval air arm. In training, experience, and ability, there was no finer air combat team in the entire Japanese Navy. Admiral Nagumo had concluded that there was no enemy carrier group anywhere in the neighborhood of his force, yet he had prudently kept on hand his first-string team to pit against enemy carriers in case they should appear. Thus, everything was in seeming readiness even for the unexpected. It remained only to give the signal if enemy ships were sighted, and the second attack wave would take care of the rest. Still, there was something disturbing about the situation. Since the search planes had set out only a short while earlier, it would probably be some time before we learned definitely from them whether or not an enemy force was in the vicinity. But this was not the only threat that might arise. It was also necessary to anticipate shore-based air attacks from Midway. Maneuvering as we were, within easy striking range of the island, with a full deckload of planes, we certainly presented an attractive target. Somehow we resembled a man walking through a lonely forest with a bag of gold on his shoulder, an inviting prey for the first robber who saw the chance to pounce upon him. Worried lest we be attacked in this vulnerable condition, I asked whether our fighter cover had taken off. "Yes, sir," was the reply. After the first attack wave left, 9 fighters were launched from Kaga. Another 9 are now standing by on our flight deck. A total of 18 fighter planes to protect the entire striking force. In the event of an enemy attack, they would be powerless to stop it. But we had already committed 36 fighters to the Midway attack, and another 36 were being held in reserve in the second attack wave. That left just 18 fighters as combat air patrol for our force of 21 ships. I had a fear that we might lose flexibility by keeping half of our strength in standby reserve. Until an enemy fleet was discovered, or its absence confirmed, a full half of our striking strength had to be kept for immediate use. And because that readiness had to be maintained even though we should be attacked by land-based planes, our flexibility of operation seemed impaired from the very outset. Weakened by my exertions and somewhat worried over the tactical situation of our force, I suddenly felt dizzy and climbed down to my cabin beneath the flight deck to rest. My thoughts, however, were with Tomonaga and his flyers about to strike the first blow at Midway. By 04:45 the first attack wave had completed forming up over the striking force, and after climbing to 4,000 meters it sped off to the southeast. When still about 150 miles from the target, these planes were discovered by an enemy flying boat. Unsuspected, it shadowed them to within 30 miles of Midway where it moved high above the formation to drop a parachute flare, alerting enemy interceptors which were already in the air in anticipation of the strike. Upon sighting the flare signal, enemy fighters swarmed to the attack. A savage air battle ensued from 06:45 to 07:10. But the tactical superiority of the Zero fighter again proved itself and the enemy challenge was successfully repulsed. Thanks to the effective protection of Lieutenant Shugenami's fighters, every one of our level bombers and 36 dive bombers arrived safely over the target. Shugenami's success in blocking the enemy fighters from making a single hit on the bombers was a feat almost without parallel in the Pacific War. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Ogawa's dive bombers screamed down on their targets through fierce anti-aircraft fire, releasing their 250 kg bombs at perilously low altitude. Simultaneously, 12 level bombers concentrated on an airstrip on Eastern Island with 800 kg bombs dropped from an altitude of 3,500 meters. The rest of the bombers demolished hangars and other installations on Eastern and Sand Islands. The absence of surprise sharply reduced the effectiveness of our attack. The fully alerted enemy had sent all of his planes aloft, some to intercept and attack, the others merely to take refuge. Finding no planes on the fields, Tomonaga's bombers attacked the hangars, which were easily destroyed, and the airstrip. But the loss of empty hangars was of little significance, and it was next to impossible for so few planes to effectively damage the airstrip. Lieutenant Tomonaga was well aware that the primary objective of the strike was to neutralize enemy air strength based on Midway. Since the first attack obviously had not achieved this goal, he concluded that it would be necessary to strike again in order to destroy the enemy planes when they returned to the island. Accordingly, as his planes headed back to the carriers, he radioed there is need for a second attack. Time 7. Japanese losses in the first wave attack were negligible. 3 level bombers and 1 dive bomber were shot down by enemy anti-aircraft fire, and only 2 fighters failed to return. Post-war American accounts fully confirm that Midway's defenders were ready and waiting for the attack. At about 0520, as recounted later, an enemy PBY had spotted our carrier force and radioed a warning back to Midway. Another PBY had sighted the Japanese air formation 150 miles from the target and followed it in. Radar stations on Midway also picked up the formation and traced its approach. Shortly after 06, every operational plane on the island took off, leaving the airstrips bare. The American fighters swiftly climbed for altitude so that they could pounce on the Japanese formations from above. All anti-aircraft batteries on the island were fully manned. When the PBY dropped its flare at a distance of 30 miles from the island to illuminate the attacking planes, the American interceptors dove into action from a 5,000-foot advantage. The strength of the Japanese force was exaggeratedly reported as 60 to 80 bombers and 50 Zero fighters. According to the American account, the defenders thought that they had shot down 53 Japanese planes during the attack, 10 by anti-aircraft fire and the rest by aerial combat, whereas there were actually only 6 Japanese planes that failed to return to the carriers. On the other hand, our flyers' claims of some 42 American planes destroyed were also exaggerated, though less flagrantly, since there were in all only 26 present. Of these, only 2 returned undamaged to the island, and the rest were either destroyed or badly shot up. The actual damage to Midway installations was, as we suspected, far from complete. However, the American account shows that the fuel supply system was so badly bombed that all subsequent fueling operations had to be carried out by hand. Some damage was done to the airstrip, and more than 20 casualties were suffered on the ground. The seaplane hangar and fuel storage tanks on Sand Island were destroyed. Back on Akagi, the departure of the Midway attack force had been followed by anxious waiting both for news of the strike itself and for enemy counteraction, which had to be expected momentarily. For the latter we had not long to wait. After descending from the flight deck, I had been in my bunk but a few minutes when a bugle sounded the alarm, air raid. This was followed almost at once by the strident roar of interceptors taking off. I counted the planes as they raced down the deck directly overhead. 9 fighters took off. I shouted unheard encouragement to the pilots but was too feeble to rise from my bunk. A glance at my watch showed the time to be 0520. The sudden quiet after the plane's takeoff was broken shortly by the shattering bark of our anti-aircraft guns. My weakness was again overcome by an insistent impulse to see what was happening, and I struggled up once more to the flight command post, where the air officer informed me that the target was a flying boat. An enemy PBY had sighted our force. The time was 0525. I asked a lookout if our fighters had shot down the PBY, and his negative reply surprised me. The air officer explained, the PBY managed to elude them by a very cunning maneuver. It was first sighted to the south, flying at about 4,000 meters. The pilot came directly overhead as if to bomb us. By the time our fighters got up to meet him, he had disappeared eastward into the clouds. We thought he had given up the contact, but he came back again. Our fighters still failed to catch him because of the clouds. Now he seems to be gone for good. A report came from our radio monitors that a long message was being sent by an enemy plane, obviously nearby because the reception was very clear. It must be the PBY's report of our position. Now we were sure to be attacked. It was just a question of what would strike us, and how soon. Again worn out by my exertion, I collapsed on the deck, helpless and giddy. An officer placed a parachute pack under my head as a pillow, and I lay there watching the brightening sky and listening to the commotion about me. At 05:35 one of Tone's search planes, launched half an hour earlier, radioed that it had sighted an enemy flying boat 40 miles out, heading for our carriers. Either the PBY which had already spotted us was coming back to resume the contact, or another was moving in for the same purpose. All eyes on Akaji's bridge searched the horizon, but for some minutes no flying boat came into sight. Then, at 05:42, a bridge-top lookout suddenly shouted, "Enemy flying boat, starboard beam, elevation 50, above the clouds, visible at intervals." Everyone fixed his gaze in the direction indicated, and the air officer called out, "There it is, very high. Over 4,000 meters." A minute later fighters were roaring off Akaji's deck to pursue the intruder. During the next hour there was a confusing succession of reported contacts on our force both by individual flying boats and by small numbers of enemy planes of unidentified type. There was also a further radio warning from Tone's search plane at 0555 that 15 enemy planes were heading toward us. The formation upped its speed to 28 knots, and Tone, after sighting 3 planes overhead at 0643, began making smoke to provide concealment against attack. Since no attack took place during this entire period, however, some of the reported contacts must have been erroneous or on our own fighters patrolling overhead. But there was no question that enemy flying boats were shadowing us, skillfully maneuvering in and out of the clouds to elude pursuit. Each time one of the persistent PBYs was sighted, now to starboard, now to port, Akaji's harassed fighter director would shout orders to our combat air patrol to go after it. The enemy pilots, however, were so adept at weaving through the clouds that the fighters merely exhausted themselves to no avail. While our own movements were thus observed and reported continuously, there was still no warning from our own search planes of any enemy task force. At 07 Lieutenant Tomonaga's message recommending a second strike against Midway was received on the bridge of flagship Akaji. Still no enemy planes had yet attacked our force, but almost immediately thereafter Tomonaga's recommendation was underlined by the first of a series of desperate shore-based air assaults which amply proved to Admiral Nagumo that enemy air strength on Midway had not been eliminated. At 07:05 a bugle sounded, "Air raid," and all eyes in the flight command post turned toward the southern sky. I managed to pull myself up for a look and noticed that it had become a beautiful day. There was fairly heavy cloud cover at about 6,000 feet, but the air was clear and visibility good. A destroyer in the van section of our ring formation suddenly hoisted a flag signal, "Enemy planes in sight." Emitting a cloud of black smoke to underline the warning, she opened fire with her anti-aircraft guns. Soon we spotted 4 planes approaching from 20 degrees to port. They looked like torpedo bombers, but before they could get close enough to permit confirmation, our fighters had pounced upon them and shot down 3, causing loud cheers all around me. The last plane gave up the attack and withdrew with our Zeros in hot pursuit. A bridge-top lookout was heard from a moment later. 6 medium land-based planes approaching, 20 degrees to starboard. On the horizon. Scanning the sky to starboard, sure enough, I saw the enemy planes flying in a single column. It looked as if the enemy had planned a converging attack from both flanks, but fortunately for us the timing was off. Following the lead destroyers, our cruisers opened fire. Then battleship Kirishima, to starboard of Akaji, loosed her main batteries at the attackers. Still they kept coming in, flying low over the water. Black bursts of anti-aircraft fire blossomed all around them, but none of the raiders went down. As Akaji's guns commenced firing, 3 Zeros braved our own anti-aircraft barrage and dove down on the Americans. In a moment's time 3 of the enemy were set aflame and splashed into the water, raising tall columns of smoke. The remaining 3 planes kept bravely on and finally released their torpedoes. Free of their cargo, the attacking plane swung sharply to the right and away, except for the lead plane which skimmed straight over Akagi, from starboard to port, nearly grazing the bridge. The white star on the fuselage of the plane, a B-26, was plainly visible. Immediately after clearing our ship, it burst into flames and plunged into the sea. About this time several torpedoes passed to port of Akagi, trailing their pale white wakes. Akagi had maneuvered so skillfully that not one torpedo scored, and everyone breathed a deep sigh of relief. This attack actually consisted of 6 torpedo planes and 4 B-26, all armed with torpedoes, which had taken off unescorted from Midway at 0615. American accounts indicate that 1 TBF and 2 B-26s were all that returned from the attack. Admiral Nagumo needed no further convincing that Midway should be hit again, and he felt that it would be safe to do so as no enemy surface force had yet been reported. Consequently, at 0715, just as the torpedo attack was ending, he ordered the planes of the second wave, which had been armed for an attack on enemy ships, to prepare instead for another strike on Midway. This meant that the torpedo-laden level bombers on Akagi and Kaga had to be dearmed and reloaded with bombs. The ones already on the flight deck were taken down to the hangar one after another, and the rearming began. Flying crews and maintenance men worked furiously at the arduous task. There was only a brief respite before the Nagumo force was attacked again. Just before 08 an Akagi lookout reported that enemy bombers were attacking Hiryu. Dark geysers of water were seen rising up around the carrier, and in the next instant identical columns were rising around Soryu. But there was no black smoke to indicate a direct hit on either ship. When the curtains of water settled, the 2 carriers were still steaming ahead, evidently unharmed. I consulted an aircraft recognition chart and found that Soryu's attackers were B-17s, the latest model United States Army bomber. There were 14 in all. A study of post-war American sources shows that these planes took off from Midway before dawn to attack the Japanese transport convoy but were diverted to the carriers. After dropping their bomb loads of more than 4 tons per plane from an altitude of 20,000 feet, they returned safely to base and optimistically reported having scored 4 hits on 2 carriers. I was chagrined to see that none of our fighters pursued the B-17s. Recalling the reported toughness of these big planes, however, I realized that the 20mm guns of our fighters would have had a hard time knocking them down anyway. Meanwhile, the forts roared defiantly away. Our anti-aircraft fire concentrated on them but registered no hits. About this time all Zeros of our second attack wave were sent up to augment our combat air patrol. At 08 a lookout reported a group of small planes coming from the direction of Midway. The lead destroyers of our screen sent up a billow of smoke and opened fire on them. Their attack method was puzzling as they came in too high for torpedo attack and too low for dive bombing. They approached in shallow dives, heading straight for Hiryu. There were 16 planes in all, widely scattered. They were jumped by 10 or more Zeros, which sent one after another spinning into the sea. Even when half of them had been shot down, the remaining planes bravely held their course and finally released bombs which seemed certain to hit the carrier. But when the bomb splashes and smoke cleared, Hiryu was still intact, steaming on as gallantly as ever. It struck me as strange that the American planes had not employed their customary, highly effective held diving technique in this attack. This was explained in post-war accounts of the American side of the action. The leader of these 16 Marine Corps dive bombers had taken off from Midway about an hour before, knowing full well that his pilots were not experienced in dive bombing. Accordingly, upon sighting the carriers, he decided on a glide bombing attack. Half of these planes never returned to their base, and 6 of the ones that did were damaged beyond repair. We had by this time undergone every kind of air attack by shore-based planes, torpedo, level bombing, dive bombing, but were still unscathed. Frankly, it was my judgment that the enemy flyers were not displaying a very high level of ability, and this evaluation was shared by Admiral Nagumo and his staff. It was our general conclusion that we had little to fear from the enemy's offensive tactics. But, paradoxically, the very ineffectiveness of the enemy attacks up to this time contributed in no small measure to the ultimate American triumph. We neglected certain obvious precautions which, had they been taken, might have prevented the fiasco that followed a few hours later. The apparently futile sacrifices made by the enemy's shore-based planes were, after all, not in vain. As the glide bombing attack ended, a destroyer on the far side of our ring formation made a smoke signal that it had spotted more enemy planes. Almost 100 were counted. The destroyer opened fire on them but stopped abruptly after a few rounds upon recognizing that it was our first attack wave returning from Midway. The time was 0830. Owing to the independent evasive maneuvering of our ships during the enemy air attacks and the peripatetic movements of the carriers while launching and recovering fighter planes, our once compact cruising disposition had become widely dispersed. It was therefore desirable to take advantage of the lull in the attacks to reform, but now the recovery of Tomonaga's planes was of greater urgency. With the veteran flyers we had at this time, speedy recovery operations on board the carriers even under stringent battle conditions were little more than child's play. Given 15 minutes from the time the ship turned into the wind, a carrier's whole complement of planes could put down on her deck with expert skill. No time was lost in getting the recovery underway. On each carrier the order was given, clear the deck to recover planes. Akagi again became a hive of activity. The uncomplaining crews, egged on by exhortations to hurry it up, fell to their jobs with tremendous energy. In a matter of minutes the flight deck was clear, and at 0837 a signal streamed from the yardarm. Commence landing. The returning planes orbited and swooped to the deck in rapid succession. By shortly after 09 all 4 carriers had recovered their planes. 3 of our crippled bombers circled once over Hiryu before coming in to land. Lieutenant Commander Masu Kawaguchi, in charge of recovery operations, instantly summoned a surgeon to the command post. One of the planes had to land on a single wheel. Lieutenant Hiroharu Kodono, the pilot, lost consciousness the moment his plane jolted to a halt. He had been hit in the leg by a machine gun bullet when enemy fighters attacked the formation near the target. Despite the pain of his wound, he flew on with the formation, made the attack, and managed to return to the carrier. Lieutenant Tomonaga's plane was hit in the left wing fuel tank, but he too managed to get back. His report included an account of the gallant death of Lieutenant Rokuro Kikuchi, a bomber pilot from Hiryu, whose plane had been fatally hit by anti-aircraft fire over the island. Kikuchi had opened the canopy, waved goodbye to his comrades, then closed it firmly, and plunged headlong to the ground. Already, however, about an hour before Tomonaga's Midway strike planes got back to the carriers, there had been a development which completely altered the battle situation confronting Admiral Nagumo. Tone's No. 4 search plane, which had been launched a full half-hour behind schedule, finally reached its 300-mile search limit on course 100 at 0720, and it then veered north to fly a 60-mile dogleg before heading back. 8 minutes later its observer suddenly discerned, far off to port, a formation of some 10 ships heading southeast. Without waiting until it could get a closer look, the plane immediately flashed a message to the Nagumo force: 10 ships, apparently enemy, sighted. Bearing 010 degree, distant 240 miles from Midway. Course 150, speed more than 20 knots. Time, 0728. This vital message was received by the flagship only after several minutes' delay occasioned by the relaying of the message through tone. When it reached Admiral Nagumo and his staff on Akagi's bridge, it struck them like a bolt from the blue. Until this moment no one had anticipated that an enemy surface force could possibly appear so soon, much less suspected that enemy ships were already in the vicinity waiting to ambush us. Now the entire picture was changed. Lieutenant Commander Ono, the staff intelligence officer, quickly plotted the enemy's reported position on the navigation chart and measured off the distance between it and our force. The enemy was just 200 miles away. This meant that he was already within striking range of our planes, but if he had carriers, we were also within his reach. The big question now was what composed the enemy force. Above all, did it contain any carriers? The complete lack of information in the search plane report on the makeup of the enemy force caused both concern and irritation to Admiral Nagumo, Chief of Staff Kusaka, and the other staff officers. 10 ships. Apparently enemy was not a very illuminating description. Obviously, the ships could only be enemy, but what types were present? At 0747, a peremptory order was flashed to the tone plane. Ascertain ship types and maintain contact. 2 minutes before this, Admiral Nagumo had already taken another action made imperative by the sighting of the enemy. Since 0715 Akagi and Kaga, whose torpedo bombers had been held back in the second attack wave, had been hurriedly rearming them with 800-kilogram bombs in place of torpedoes for another strike on Midway. The rearming had by this time been more than half completed. Now, however, it was urgently necessary to maintain readiness to meet the enemy fleet in case further information from the tone plane confirmed it to be a real threat to the Nagumo force. Therefore, at 0745, Admiral Nagumo ordered the rearming of the two carriers' torpedo bombers to be immediately suspended and directed his whole force to prepare for a possible attack on enemy ships. At 0758 the tone searchplane radioed that the enemy had changed course to 080. But again the ship types were not mentioned. The staff officers were now fuming with angry impatience, and at 08 another dispatch went out ordering the searchplane to report the composition of the enemy force immediately. Finally, at 0809, the reply came in: enemy ships are 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Just as I thought, Ono said triumphantly, there are no carriers. He handed the message to the chief of staff. Kusaka's reaction was that, if the enemy force was without carriers, it could safely be taken care of later, and the Nagumo force could first finish destroying enemy air strength based on Midway. The relief inspired by the 0809 message, however, was short-lived. At 0820 the tone plane was heard from again, and this time it reported, enemy force accompanied by what appears to be aircraft carrier bringing up the rear. This information electrified everyone. But there was still a residue of doubt because of the words appears to be. The identification was not certain. And if the enemy force did include a carrier, why had not carrier-type aircraft yet joined in the attacks on the Nagumo force? So reasoned the optimists. At 0830 still another message came in from the tone plane. It reported 2 additional enemy ships, apparently cruisers, sighted. Bearing 008, distant 250 miles from Midway. Course 150, speed 20 knots. From the size of the enemy force, Admiral Nagumo now concluded that it must contain at least 1 carrier. It was therefore essential, he decided, to attack these ships before launching another strike on Midway. However, serious obstacles stood in the way of an immediate attack. Not only had the greater part of Akagi's and Kaga's torpedo bombers already been rearmed with bombs by the time Admiral Nagumo ordered the rearming suspended at 0745. But in addition, all Zeros of the 2nd Attack Wave Fighter Escort had been sent aloft to reinforce our combat air patrol against the repeated attacks by enemy shore-based planes. As a result, the only planes that were actually armed appropriately for an attack on enemy ships and lined up on the flight decks ready for takeoff were the 36 dive bombers of Hiryu and Soryu. Admiral Nagumo's dilemma was a difficult one, indeed. If he launched the dive bombers for a forestalling attack on the enemy task force, they would have no fighter protection and losses might be severe. Also, there was the question of whether to use the torpedo bombers now lined up on the flight decks of Akagi and Kaga but already rearmed with 800-kilogram bombs. These bombs, though less effective than torpedoes against a ship target, could still inflict severe damage if hits were scored. But the torpedo bombers required fighter protection far more, even, than the dive bombers. To bomb effectively, they must maintain a straight and level course, which gives no opportunity for evasive maneuvering. Without protective escort, they would be easy prey for nimble enemy fighters. As Admiral Nagumo pondered his course of action, the return of Tomonaga's planes from the Midway strike made a quick decision imperative. Some of the planes were in distress and the fighter escorts were running low on fuel, so that their recovery could not be long delayed without risking added losses. Either the carrier's decks must be cleared by launching the dive and torpedo bombers to attack the enemy without fighter cover, or the planes must be moved to make way for the recovery, thus making it impossible to launch an attack until sometime later. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi, the aggressive commander of Car Div 2, chose this moment to make an urgent recommendation to Admiral Nagumo. In his flagship, Hiryu, which was maneuvering at some distance from Akagi, he had anxiously been following the successive sighting reports from Tone's searchplane, and Admiral Nagumo's failure to order prompt offensive action against the enemy task force struck him as unwise and dangerous. He now addressed a signal to his superior, relayed by destroyer Noaki. The signal read: consider it advisable to launch attack force immediately. In Admiral Nagumo's judgment, however, the risks involved in sending out an attack force without fighter protection were too great. The slaughter of the unescorted American planes which had attacked his ships within the past hour and a half was, after all, pretty convincing proof of that. A wiser course, he thought, was first to recover both the Midway strike planes and the second-wave fighters which had been diverted to combat air patrol, then to reorganize his forces while temporarily retiring northward to avoid further air attack, and finally, when all preparations were complete, to turn around and destroy the enemy task force by an all-out attack. Nagumo's reasoning was logical enough. His force was well balanced and appeared greatly superior in strength. Therefore, it would be easy to destroy the enemy if all his striking power were thrown into a single, massive attack. Such strategy was orthodox, but it had one flag: neglect of the time factor. Victory in battle does not always go to the stronger, it often goes to the side which is quicker to act boldly and decisively to meet unforeseen developments, and to grasp fleeting opportunities. By his decision, taken shortly after 0830, to recover the Midway strike before doing anything else, Admiral Nagumo virtually committed himself to the second, more cautious plan of action. On board Akagi, when the order was given to clear the deck for recovery, the weary maintenance crews began once more to lower the torpedo bombers to the hangar deck. There, the orders now were to switch back from bombs to torpedoes. Flight Officer Masuda, whose light-heartedness and good nature seemed to prevail under any circumstances, greeted these instructions with amazingly cheerful astonishment. "Here we go again," he exclaimed. "This is getting to be like a quick change contest." While the returning planes came down one after another on the flight deck, the work of rearming the torpedo bombers on the hangar deck below proceeded furiously. The crew, clad only in tropical shorts and half-sleeved shirts, hastily unloaded the heavy bombs, just piling them up beside the hangar because there was no time to lower them to the magazine. There would be cause to recall and regret this haphazard disposal of the lethal missiles when enemy bombs later found their mark in Akagi. At 0855, as the recovery operations neared completion, Admiral Nagumo acted to put the rest of his plan into execution. A blinker signal sent out to all ships ordered after completing recovery operations. Force will temporarily head northward. We plan to contact and destroy enemy task force. Simultaneously with this order, Admiral Nagumo dispatched a radio to Admiral Yamamoto in Yamato and to Vice Admiral Kondo, commanding the Midway invasion force, to inform them of the critical new developments. The message said enemy force of 1 carrier, 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers discovered at 08, bearing 010, distant 240 miles from Midway. We will head for it. By 0918 the recovery of the last plane of the Midway attack force as well as the second-wave fighters on combat air patrol had been completed. Course was set at 030, and the force sped on at 30 knots to lessen the danger from Midway-based air and at the same time achieve a position of advantage over the enemy fleet. During all this feverish activity and excitement, I had remained prostrate on the deck at the flight command post, a helpless spectator of events. Our success in beating off the much-feared attacks by enemy shore-based planes had led me to share the prevailing optimism. Then, someone had told me of the sighting of the enemy task force, but I did not learn until after the operation the details of the discussions on Akagi's bridge which led up to Admiral Nagumo's final decision to defer action until he could mount an all-out attack. Unaware of these deliberations, I felt relieved that our second attack wave had not yet been committed to Midway, at the same time regretting the hasty rearming of our torpedo bombers for a land attack. At least, I thought, the dive bomber group from Hiryu and Soryu was ready to attack the enemy, and I expected that it would be ordered off the carriers momentarily. This expectation and hope waned as the recovery of the first attack wave got underway with no sign that the dive bombers had yet taken off. It gave way to dismayed surprise when I learned of Admiral Nagumo's order issued at 0855. Indicating that no attack would be launched until we had time to reorganize our forces while temporarily retiring northward. Looking back on this critical moment, which ultimately was to decide the battle, I can easily realize what a difficult choice faced the force commander. Yet, even now, I find it hard to justify the decision he took. Should he not have sacrificed every other consideration in favor of sending the dive bombers immediately against the enemy ships? Should he not have dispatched the torpedo bombers also? Even though armed with bombs, he could have launched them to orbit until enough fighters could be recovered, refueled and launched again to provide escort. The planes back from Midway could have been kept in the air at least until the bombers had cleared. Damaged planes, if unable to remain aloft any longer, could have crash-landed in the sea, where destroyers would have rescued their crews. Wise after the event, the saying goes. Still, there is no question that it would have been wiser to launch our dive bombers immediately, even without fighter protection. In such all-or-nothing carrier warfare, no other choice was admissible. Even the risk of sending unprotected level bombers should have been accepted as necessary in this emergency. Their fate would probably have been the same as that of the unescorted American planes which had attacked us a short while before, but just possibly they might have saved us from the catastrophe we were about to suffer.